Hi, and welcome to today's Engaging for Missouri webinar. I'm Alice Roach from the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri, and I'll be your host today. With each of these 30-minute webinars, we intend to share research-based insights that leaders like you can apply in your own work to benefit and strengthen the state's agriculture and food system, hospitality sector, and communities. Today, Mallory, Rahe, and Alan Spell will present about the economic contribution of Missouri's distilling industry. Before I invite them to begin, I want to share a few housekeeping items. First, we'll close today's presentation with a question and answer session. Those of you who connected via your computer may submit your questions in the chat screen. So to open the chat, just click the chat icon that you see at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you joined today by phone, then you may email me your questions at roacham@missouri.edu. Second, all attendees are muted and may not start their video. Third, if you encounter any technical problems today, then you can let me know by either submitting a comment in the chat screen, or you can also send me an email at roacham@missouri.edu, and I'll do my best to help you troubleshoot. And last, we'll make a recording of today's presentation available, and we'll also have the slides available. You can look for an email from Zoom that shares more about where you can access the recording and slides sometime tomorrow. And you can find an archive of all of our previous Engaging for Missouri webinars on our division's YouTube channel. So with that, we'll transition to the topic of today's webinar, which is titled Taking Farm and Forest to the Glass, the Economic Contribution of Missouri's Distilling Industry. Presenting are Dr. Mallory, Rahe, and Alan Spell, who are both assistant extension professors in our division. So thanks to Mallory and Alan for presenting. And Alan, if you could please unmute your microphone and start your video, then we can begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you for attending today's webinar. Let's go ahead and get started. So Taking Field and Forest to Glass project started early in 2020 through a grant from the Missouri Department of Agriculture. The Missouri Agriculture Small Business and Development Authority provided funding for us to study the distillery industry and the value chain businesses. It's a really interesting project to get an idea of how this industry is growing. There's a diversity of businesses out there, so we were really honored to be able to study this. We also wanted to look at the economic contribution of this industry to the state and to study in more detail those value chains that support that, because that's really a lot of times what's something that we can take away from these studies is how that value chain interacts and how we might take advantage of growth opportunities. So the MU team included Mallory and myself, but also Dr. Sarah Lowe, Hannah McClure, and other faculty such as Dusty Walter from National Natural Resources Management. We also had a value chain steering committee, which was really critical to the success of this project. That included people from the Missouri Craft Distillers Guild, David and Lynn. We also had representation from the large wood barrel manufacturer Independent Stave, Missouri Forest Products Association, corn growers, and tourism from Visit KC with Jason Foley. I really can't emphasize enough how important that steering committee was to help us understand really some more details about this industry, especially because we have a lot of different players doing a lot of different things. So the first thing we wanted to do is to engage our stakeholders. We had a lot of learning to do, and Mallory and I and Sarah had the opportunity to present at the Missouri Craft Distillers Guild meeting in January of 2020. That was a really valuable meeting because we had to talk to them about what we were doing, and really importantly, had to engage them in the understanding of the information we would need to analyze their industry. That's a really tough thing for companies to understand, that we're going to be asking them for some confidential data, some data about their sales, how they operate. So you have to build that trust with the industry, and this is a critical meeting. So we did that in January to outline the survey that we would need to do, and then we also communicated with the value chain committee on the best approach and to get some contact information. Now, we'll cover some of the numbers of the industry here in a bit, but just to tell you, we had over 60 different firms that we reached out to with email and phone calls, and we really tried an effort to get as much communication to them as possible. We surveyed 22 in total for a 35% response rate. Now, what was really unique about this survey, I think, and a real learning experience, was because we're asking for really sensitive data from these companies going back years, we really wanted to make sure, one, it was confidential so that those businesses could be assured that we would not release their information. and that even when we aggregate information, we wouldn't use it in a way that somebody could be identified. So for example, we had a very diverse group of distillers, some very, very large, some very, very small. The very large ones, as you can understand, would be very sensitive to their data being shown. But thankfully, I think through the value chain committee and through our efforts with the Craft Distillers Guild, there was some really good feeling about the responses there. We set up information beforehand, gave it to the distillers and said, listen, this is what we're going to be asking for. That gave them some hours to fill out some information, because when they went to actually fill out the online survey, we did not even record their IP address. That's how secure we wanted this to be. So that means you can't save the survey and come back to it later. So it was really important for them to fill out the survey in one city. So all of that took a lot of effort. But doing that, we collected information about sales, past and expected future sales, sales by different spirits and restaurants and activities that they're doing, information about their visitors, information about their fees and costs, and then also information about their inputs. Now, we planned a second survey, but as you can imagine, COVID kind of interrupted those plans. Luckily, we were able to talk with some focused interviews with certain individuals in certain industries that helped us develop some of the information a little bit more richer than we would have done with just one survey. So we felt like it was a good survey. It was a very diverse response, very large distillers, very small. So you can imagine when we're trying to develop central tendency figures, what's the average for an industry? It's really hard when you have a few big players and a lot of small players and different responses. So we did a lot of looking at different ways to describe the industry. Sometimes we described them with a couple of different measures, medians, trim, means. We also made sure that in any information that we revealed, we did not disclose information that could be pinned back to one company. So that means the survey brief, which is out there for you to look at, we'll have some limited information on some topics because we just don't want to disclose those businesses' information. So now we're going to turn to the industry overview and really the value chain connections and what we learned from that. And for that, Mallory's going to take this part.
Thanks, Alan. As Alan said, distillers aren't unique. A lot of industries they're dominated by a few large firms and a great number of small firms. And you have to look at these firms differently because they behave differently. They pursue different markets and they have different cost structures. So when we talk about economic impact later today, a lot of this is attributed to our state's large distillers. And when you look at the colored figure on the slide, where these spirits are going, large distillers are primarily selling outside of our state, and the blue is selling outside of the US. Small distillers, those that produce less than 10,000 proof gallons, rely heavily on on-site sales at their distillery. 42% of all of their sales compared to less than 1% for large distillers. So that just gives you a sense of how these two different firm sizes are really trying to get established in the industry. And I do want to point out that even our small distillers are accessing export markets and are really focused on growing their sales and are trying to reach more consumers wherever they can. And you can see on the table over here sort of looks at the distillers in our state by different sizes. And we found 20 distillers that are in the planning or early stage out of our total group of 70, but there's 50 active distilleries. Next. So this project was important because nationally, there is a shift towards the craft spirits industry by consumers. We saw it happen in beer, and as that has reached some level of maturity, consumers are now demanding craft spirits and more of that unique, differentiated product. So we've seen that the overall market volume for spirit sales has really shifted in the craft direction. And Missouri is well positioned to benefit from this. We rank 16th in the nation in sort of the total number of craft distillers and 10th in the nation by total jobs. And when you look at our growth from 2017 to 2018, we actually outpaced the US average. When we surveyed these firms early in 2020 and asked them to look at the next 2 years, our small distillers had really big growth expectations. They were planning to double their output by 2021. When you look at this industry, it's gotten a lot more organized since 2018. So the small distillers have formed the Missouri Craft Distillers Guild in 2018. In 2019, there was the successful passage of the Missouri Bourbon Bill signed by Governor Parson, and this created a unique definition to reach consumers. So Missouri bourbon must be mashed, fermented, distilled, aged, and bottled in Missouri. Furthermore, it must use Missouri white oak barrels and Missouri corn. And as we're going to show you, these are areas of strength for our state. Next. So when we think about how distillers differ, we talked about different inputs. So we looked at inputs by large and small distillers. And I want to take a moment to show you some of those differences. So the gray bars show you how large distillers differ from small distillers. A lot more of their total input cost as a percentage go to buying other distilled liquors for blending. They also have significantly higher packaging costs. When you look at our smaller distillers in the yellow bars, they're spending more of their input cost on grain and other agricultural commodities and wood barrels for barrel aging. We also, in our survey, learned that small distillers are more likely to make purchases within the state. And when they do buy grain and other ag inputs, they're spending more per unit to get higher quality or to pay for more services for that product. But again, it's really the volume purchasing by the large distillers that has the biggest impact, and their ability to purchase in state supports a lot of jobs. Next. So we wanted to kind of diagram the value chain. And again, a value chain just traces the businesses and the processes that bring a final raw inputs to final users. And so this is kind of a visualization of that value chain for our distillers. And we'll kind of walk through this a little bit. Next. So when you look at our inputs, Missouri has a number of strengths on the input side. I'm going to start with sort of our white oak timber and our wood barrels. And Missouri is home to 2 internationally recognized barrel producers. We're world leaders when it comes to white oak barrels. And white oak is used because it has very dense pores and, keeps the liquid inside, which is where you want it to stay. And then we also have, of course, we're a grain state, and distillers use a wide number of grains. I mentioned that our distillers are purchasing and paying a premium for organic and specialties. Many of our distillers are pursuing that Missouri grown labeling, and that's how they're differentiating their product beyond the Missouri Bourbon Bill. When you look at other aspects of this value chain, we found some other surprising stories. So Missouri is home to affordable distilling equipment, which has become a nationally recognized brand in less than 10 years. A Missouri entrepreneur, Paul Hall, saw an opportunity with the growth of the craft spirits industry, and his company produces stills of a wide variety of range to allow producers to lower their cost of entry and then slowly scale up. And he estimates he has equipment in 20% of US distilleries at this point. We also have a fairly robust beverage industry, and distilling is a part of that. So when you look at glass and plastic bottles, Missouri has a higher share of jobs in both of these industries than the national average, and our growth in the plastic bottle industry has outpaced the US industry. And these plastic and glass bottles are going beyond just beverages. Next. So this map just provides a visual representation of a partial footprint of the distilling industry. where they're buying from, who they're selling to. I'll also point out that the dark brown diamonds are all of the active distillers, known distilleries, and the light brown diamonds are those distilleries that are still in the planning stage. And this again is only an incomplete list based on the distillers who did respond. Next. So when you look at the forward linkages or where this value chain is going, distillers are trying to reach customers in a variety of ways and as directly as possible to capture more revenue, especially those smaller distillers. Some, but not all, choose to operate tasting rooms. Some have developed full bars and restaurants to build that richer customer experience and brand awareness, but they rely very heavily on distributors for retail sales, both inside and outside Missouri, and the support of other agencies to promote tourism. Next. We're going to go into some growth issues very briefly. We found from our survey that there's a very high startup cost to get into this industry, even with the growth in smaller equipment and stills. So we estimate that a craft distiller will spend $300,000 to have the machinery, equipment, and construction in place. Next. Another issue is that Missouri does not allow direct shipping of alcohol. And this is a problem that is common across many states, although some, those yellow dots, indicate the states that are starting to modernize their legislation, oftentimes to bring spirits into parity with wine and beverage makers. So here in Missouri, our distillers are advocating for the opportunity to ship directly. Again, it leaves more revenue in the hands of the producer instead of relying on a distributor. We also see that nationally, there is a lot of concern about the sustainability of white oak and barrel production. With the growth of first wine and now spirits, there's been a lot of pressure to increase barrel production, and there's concern that in forest management, this is really a long-term project, this idea of sustainability. It's a multi-generation project. Here in Missouri, a lot of our white oak is on private land, and we see data from the Forest Service found, annual mortality rates are increasing for our white oak. Our net growth is down when you look at data from 2012 to 2017, and our harvest levels have also declined during that same period. So while we still have abundant resources, there's concern about this in the future. And then one really pressing concern was just recently resolved when the president signed that bill December 27th, the omnibus bill. It also contained the Craft Beverage Modernization Act. And this created a permanent reduction in federal excise taxes from $13.50 a proof gallon to $2.70, a very significant reduction, something that distillers in Missouri and nationally were really striving for. It especially helps those small distillers just have more wiggle room in their production. And I'll turn it back to Alan now. Thank you.
All right, so now we'll talk about the industry economic contribution. And we'll start first just with the idea of tourism spending. We touched on it earlier. Especially the smaller distillers are really dependent on those visitors coming to their operation, seeing the distillery operation, and also providing, in addition to spirits, other opportunities like restaurants, bars, retail, venues as well. So visitor spending is really important. The survey respondents indicated about 257,000 visitors spent about 7.2 million in the state in 2019. That averages about $28 per visitor. So about the other thing we want to understand, though, is the spending inside versus outside the state, what comes from outside visitors, because that's bringing in new dollars to the state. About 40% of visitors were from outside Missouri. And the chart to the right shows you that as distiller size increases, so does the amount of out-of-state visitors. For example, our medium to large survey respondents said about half, a little bit over half of their visitors came from outside the state, about 1 in 4 for the smaller distillers. So as they increase in size, that increases the percentage of out-of-state visitors, and that's obviously growing our economy by bringing in new dollars. Now, important to understanding the total contribution of our distilling industry to our economy, we have to look at not just the survey respondents, but also the total amount of spending and production that happens in the state. So for tourism, for example, while we had 257,000 indicated from our survey, we wanted to look at what that broader number might be. So the Missouri Division of Tourism had an estimate of 336,000 visitors to distilleries, and that seemed reasonable given what our survey respondents had already given us. So if you multiply that by the $28, you get 9.4 million. So that's a fairly good number for that. Now, when we look at also the total sales of distillers in Missouri, we also needed the help of the Missouri Public Safety Agency that had data on taxes for distillers. That helped us understand the broader sales that were happening. And so we use that information to help understand the contribution. Before I show you the numbers, though, I want to give you an illustration of what contribution analysis does. It's an impact of the direct effects of distillers to our economy, but also the supply chain and the household spending of workers that are involved in this industry and supply chain and how they impact the economy. So this diagram here shows you a little bit of that effect, and we've got job numbers here to show you that as well. So a distiller in the center is going to hire employees, is going to make investments, have on-site activities. Directly, they employed about 600 people. Now they're going to buy from suppliers, corn, wood barrels, transportation services, etc. And they're also going to pay wages to their workers. Those suppliers are paying wages to their workers. So together, those workers are spending on regular things like rent and gas and utilities and food and clothing in the economy. So that's impacting us as well. Every time we have that cycle of spending, though, some money leaks out. We don't spend all of our money in Missouri. Sometimes we buy things on Amazon and that thing is made elsewhere, or specialized equipment that's made elsewhere. So every time things go around, they leak out a little bit. And so that's what contribution analysis does. It looks at all of that. So the total effect of 600 jobs ultimately created 1,700 jobs, or supported 1,700 jobs. Oops. Well, for some reason, my, let's see here. I don't know why my impact slide isn't showing. Well, interestingly enough, I don't see the actual impact slide. Let me escape out of here real quick and see if I can find out what happened.
Alan, I can share that slide if you'd like me to.
Thanks. I see it actually in the presentation, but it's not sharing. So let me, now I've got it up. Let me see now if I can reshare.
Okay, great.
Quickly. Okay, how about that? All right. Sorry for that little technical glitch here. So the contribution of the distillery industry, we started out with those direct effects. Again, there's 600 jobs. Now, those 600 jobs have income. That labor income includes wages, but also their compensation, profits, income, and all that information. Value added, or GDP, is about 250 million in direct gross domestic product or value add to our state. And then gross sales, which includes that final demand of sales plus those inputs, is a larger number of 367 million. Now, when you look at the indirect effects of supplier inputs, household spending, you can see all the numbers there. I won't cover them all here, but you can see that the total effect is the support of 1,753 jobs and about 358 million in gross domestic product. So from a simple way to kind of summarize that from the jobs angle is every one job in distilling supports 1.9 jobs elsewhere in the economy. So that's the bottom line of that contribution, pretty significant for our state. And again, this information, while helpful, is also helpful, I feel like, in the value of understanding those value chains and how we can support and grow this industry. So with that, we have time for questions, I hope.
We sure do. So if you do have a question, we're happy to entertain that. You can just add it here in the chat screen, or you can also send me an email at roacham@missouri.edu. So to get us started, you mentioned that COVID-19 challenged your ability to collect data from Missouri distillers. Have you gotten any sense of how the pandemic affected their businesses and how their reliance on in-state visitors feeds into that?
Well, I can start, and Mallory, obviously, we can talk back and forth about this. We really at first were in talking with the craft distillers. Obviously they were concerned March on with their impact, and especially the smaller ones with how this was going to impact their visitors, because they rely so much on their in-state and regional visitors. So they were very concerned with that initially, and that concern was not unfounded. Obviously, they lost a lot in terms of sales. The weird thing in a large scale for the U.S. is that we actually bought more as citizens in spirits and beer and wine to get us through the situation. So on the one hand, we're not going to visit these smaller craft distillers who really depend on those visitors, but we are spending more on distilled spirits. So larger companies that can take advantage of that opportunity or able to, they probably fared better than the smaller ones who just really could not have access to customers. Now you can think of distillers, larger, medium to large distillers in bigger cities like Kansas City and St. Louis, where there was the ability to have carry out service, maybe combined with their restaurants, stuff. They could take advantage of that a little bit. But some of the things like the sale of hand sanitizer helped a little bit initially at first, but it wasn't a long-term solution for them, obviously. And I think while we think sometimes, well, with spirit sales going up, great, and with them selling hand sanitizer, everybody's okay. It's not really the case. They really struggled, and I really feel like for the very early planning stage firms, this really put a big hit on them. So,
Mallory, do you have any comments you'd like to add?
Well, no, Alan covered it well. I'll just add that, one thing we learned from talking with the distillers is that pivot to creating hand sanitizer had real cost associated with it. And, the ones we talked to said it helped keep the lights on for a few months, but a lot of that demand dried up, and they were, they still had incurred those costs to kind of get that up and going. But it was something that they were in a unique position to help and to help address people's fears and concerns, and could pivot, and we're grateful to be able to do that. But many of them are just glad to be back to making spirits again, which is what they are best at.
Sure. If you could skip back to your slide where you show the input cost analysis.
okay.
I have a question about grain other than corn. It was a sizable share of input costs for smaller distillers. What other types of grains were they using, and why do we see such a large disparity there between large and small entities?
Sure, I can address that. So our distillers, we talked about the Missouri Bourbon Bill, but we don't want anybody to think that's all we make in this state. We make a wide variety of spirits. Distillers are using a wide variety of grains, including corn, wheat, barley, rye, others. And when we talk to distillers, you see those higher prices reflected. Some of it's in smaller quantities. Some of it is producers that really search out organic or specialty varieties and are paying a premium for those products. But then these distillers also just require more services with their grain. They may get it delivered or milled and bagged, and they have to buy smaller quantities. So all of these things contribute to these higher prices that you see here.
Great, thank you for that. We do have an attendee question here about whether any of the distillers access the PPE funds that were available.
So I talked to them about that, and they certainly tried. But to get into a little bit of details about hand sanitizer, there's two different kinds, liquid and gel, and the PPP funds were for gel hand sanitizers. to make gel hand sanitizers, you have to have a specialty input that was largely only available from China. Our firm struggled to get that input. They were primarily making liquid hand sanitizer, so they did not qualify for that state funding. And yeah.
So a follow-up question here related to the cost to produce hand sanitizer rather, was the equipment cost around $200,000? That's what someone had heard. Is that roughly a ballpark number, or are you aware of a different estimate?
I don't have an estimate on that. We did not try to collect that information.
Sure, understood. And then one last question to wrap up. You mentioned that white oak barrels are the standard, but are distillers exploring any alternatives given that there may be some long-term supply challenges there?
Well, white oak are superior. I know for sure that at least one of our distillers uses pecan barrels for flavor, but acknowledges that that leads to a lot of leakages, but really values the taste characteristics that that brings. Primarily, however, white oak is the standard. Some barrels are made out of chinkapin oak, but most is white oak.
Great. Well, thank you to Mallory and Alan for presenting today's presentation, and thank you to our audience for joining us. When you exit Zoom, you'll see a post-webinar survey will load in your browser. If you'd please consider responding, we'll use your results to improve the webinar experience and also brainstorm future topics. Again, sometime tomorrow, you should receive a recording of today's presentation as well as the slides that were presented. You can join our next Engaging for Missouri webinar on Wednesday, February 10th. At that time, Ben Brown, who's a senior research associate in our division, will speak about what changes for agriculture under a Biden administration. Again, thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a great Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.